All righty. Hello, everyone. I know we're all just joining here. Welcome. I'm just going to give a little intro. My name is Emily, and I lead the content team here at Front. Today, we've got two incredible leaders with us, and they're known for radical transparency. So that is, of course, our topic of discussion today. We've got Mathilde, who I'm lucky to work with all the time at Front. And we've also got Patrick Campbell, who's the CEO of Profitwell. So I'm particularly excited to chat today because transparency has been central to our values at Front from day one. And Patrick, I know it's core to the way you all work at Profitwell as well. So as we'll go over later, transparency is also a particularly hot topic for businesses given the pandemic, and everything that's been occurring over the last year and a half. So the way this will work is I will be just asking questions. I'll let our experts each take a moment to answer here, and it should be a quick and actionable session, no more than 30 minutes. We'll be recording the whole thing, so everyone who's in attendance here will get a recording afterwards as well if you want to listen in again. So hopefully we'll all get some good inspiration and some actionable tips that you can take back for your own companies. Let's dive right in. Okay, so for starters, let's set the stage. How do we define transparency for a company? Because this can look like a lot of different things. It can be transparency with your customers. It can be with your team. It can be about your supply chain. What does it mean for you all at Front and Profitwell? And Mathilde, I'll have you go first.
Thank you, Emily. Well, I think like for us, I don't see any part of the organization where it doesn't apply. So what I mean by that is I think transparency is internal. So are we transparent with our employees, with our investors? It's external. How are we transparent with our customers? Like, for example, we have a public roadmap and people can go on frontapp.com/roadmap and see what we're thinking about building and currently building. It's also external with our community. We publish, for example, our decks, funding decks. And so we're, of course, transparent with our candidates. So for us, I think transparency really is for everyone. We'll then talk about it later. It doesn't mean we share everything to everyone, but I wouldn't be able to say, well, we're transparent, but there is this specific group where we're not.
I like that. Yeah, for us, it's pretty similar. I think we might, in some places, actually be a little bit less transparent than Front is, and in probably the other places, we're about the same. I think when we think about this, it starts at kind of like the internal level. So at Profitwell, basically, with the exception of certain HR things, we don't always like proactively say things. That's only because we don't think to say them. But if anyone reactively asks a question, we will make sure that they get a transparent, direct answer. I think that some companies, as we'll talk about in a bit, go even further and actually share some of the HR stuff, which is really interesting to talk about. But I also think that for us, we're really transparent on an interpersonal level, and I think that sometimes gets us in trouble. So we've had an interesting experience with that, because sometimes transparency can be misconstrued as maybe going a little too direct, and not keeping in mind the conversation. And then externally, we're really transparent with things that are going on with the business, product launches, these types of things. But we've kind of chosen not to kind of go full into kind of the building and public world that's kind of coming about in the past couple of years. I don't think Front does as much of that. I think we all do a little bit of it, depending on the definition. But that's also an interesting thing to kind of talk about, because I think that there's the belief for some companies that this is the best way to market, is to go so transparent into every single detail of what's going on, to the point that there's some folks who were live streaming their lives building a company. I don't think anyone's doing that now, but they were doing that a couple of years ago. So yeah, to define it is basically piggybacking off Mathilde just said, and then adding a little color.
Awesome. Thanks for setting that stage there. So why right now? We are on the tail end of this pandemic. The United States has been experiencing the peak of racial injustice and a lot of social inequalities. So why is transparency particularly top of mind for businesses? And Patrick, we'll have you go first here.
Oh yeah, just you went right for it there. You went right for the controversial piece, and then I gotta go. No, I'm just kidding. I think what's really interesting is if we take a huge step back, right? Like this is a multi-century trend, right? If you think about even like the Gutenberg Bible, right? Like all of a sudden when they started printing more things, they got into the hands of more people. And, just over time, we've gotten the speed of information increasing more and more. And then as there has been more, equilibrium in some places, all of a sudden there's been a little bit more of a demand for transparency, right? Like consumers are starting to get more transparency, and therefore they're demanding better ingredients in their products. And team members are getting more kind of, optionality in where they work, not only physically, but also just in terms of, you're not just someone in a factory as much anymore, although obviously those jobs do exist. And even in those jobs, there's more demands that are coming because of the sharing of information. So I think it's just a big trend. And we're now reaching a point where there's a lot of, just these flashes of very like, unfortunately controversial things that are happening. And this is all making us kind of think through like, how much information is enough, right? You even see this in people debating Facebook and social media, where in some cases it's like, maybe it's too fast. Like maybe the information's moving too fast and we need to slow down a little bit. But yeah, I think it's just a multi-century trend that we're kind of reaching a really interesting point in that trend. That's, I can't even imagine it going faster. And therefore, we're kind of maybe not at the end, but we're at an interesting point, basically.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if you think about now and specifically think about like everything that's been going on in the world, companies right now really care about making sure their workforce is engaged, because there are so many things that go against engaged employees right now. And so one of the reasons why I think it's a really good moment to implement more transparency in your company is because I don't believe transparency is good just because it's good. I think it's a mean to an end, and there are many benefits that we'll talk about, but one of them being more engagement. Like I feel like when you're transparent, people feel part of the journey. They understand the why behind everything they're doing, other companies prioritizing, and then that leads to engaged employees. And so more than ever, this is needed. Another reason is obviously COVID has, impacted businesses either for the best or not necessarily for the best. And in a world where so many things are changing, like we all had a plan, and then maybe this plan is not the plan anymore for whatever reason. I think that building trust with your company is very important. So different from engagement, but trust is important. And again, transparency is what I found one of the most efficient way to build trust. And so this is why, for example, I know that, we have a Front podcast, and Zeus Living is a company that was really impacted by the pandemic. And what they said was they released their financials to the company because the reason for it is trust needs to be built with the team, and people should understand what to expect. So to me, like, to add to what you said, Patrick, I think that these are two reasons why transparency now is even more important than it was 18 months ago.
Yeah. It's also interesting too, and it gets into like a funny, it's all about the line, right? Because there's probably, and you and I can debate later when we get into the negatives potentially, because it's, there's a point where like it can actually hurt trust too if you go so transparent, because there's so much cognitive load or something like that it feels like, oh, Mathilde doesn't know what she's doing or something like that if you went too far, right, to certain people. I know I've run into that personally, and so it gets interesting, but I think that we can all agree it's a super important impression topic right now.
Yeah.
So, Mathilde, I know you just touched on employee engagement as being a key benefit that you've seen from being transparent with your team. What would you say some of the other large benefits have been for your team at Front?
So I think engagement is one of them. The second one is, at the end of the day, it's also a good business decision, because I do believe it makes organizations more efficient. You have way less meetings. The context is most of the time known. So less things need to happen for people to understand the why. So I think efficiency is definitely one of them. I would say that just culture, not just about engagement, but I've always found, and when I've discussed with others about transparency, I think as your company grows, it's probably the most efficient way to prevent politics from happening, because politics happen usually because you try to have power that other people don't have. And clearly having information, if it's a source of power, then people will try to have it. And so if it's not even a question, that access to information is a good thing and a different thing depending on who you are in the company, then I think politics won't happen. So I think engagement and trust that we've talked about, but no politics and efficiency are the two ones I would definitely add.
I think some other ones on this end. I didn't want to interrupt Emily. I just want to make sure we're rolling. I think another one that kind of off the politics front, there's a lot of, if we go to larger companies, right, where there's, and even smaller companies, like it can help uncover ethical dilemmas, it can help uncover like things that you're trying to optimize for. I know that whenever I felt like, oh, maybe I shouldn't share this, sometimes it comes from a place of like, oh, maybe I actually don't want to be accountable to that thing that I really should be accountable to, right? And I think that accountability factor, I think, is huge, especially when you get into kind of DEI, making sure that your companies are pushing forward, and a lot of other things, just in terms of even just your growth, right? Like, hey, we're going to go after this number. Well, if you don't like say the number, then you can say, oh yeah, we did fine, if you don't hit the number, right? But I think it's super important, because it also helps people understand where they fit, gives them that trust that you talked about. And then one of my favorite pieces of this is that there's no one person who makes or breaks a company. And because of that, on the employee engagement side that you're talking about, I need to make sure that that person making a decision on the front line has as much information to make those decisions as possible. And it can get too much, but I think that's a huge thing that a lot of people talk about with transparency, is that you're hiring smart people. They need to make decisions, and the best way to make decisions is have that data.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, one interesting thing is, maybe 2 years ago, I was asked to give a talk on what makes Front a great place to work, because we have a really high internal NPS. And I was like, it's my first company, so I have no idea. And, what makes Front a great place to work today might not work for other companies, and also might not work 2 years from now. Anyways, so because I didn't know at all how to go about this talk, I sent a survey to a few people at Front, and I asked them, why are you so happy and engaged? And the first thing they said, like number one, was they said, I understand how my goals contribute to the company's goals and how we're performing on them. And I think it's very related to, your company is not doing well because one person is doing something extraordinary. It's like a group of people that all contribute in their own way to the company's mission, and making sure that they know how they contribute, I think plays a huge role in actually hitting your goals.
Yeah. And I think that, just to give a real world example from our end too, like I'm sure this happened with Front, like with COVID, everyone was just like, I don't know what's happening. Like no one knew for at least 4 or 5 weeks, and for longer than that. But the initial 4 to 5 weeks, everyone was just like, what's going to happen? Is the market going to tank? Are we going to lose all our customers? Like no one knew, right? And what I at least found is, because we had already had like a very consistent, culture of publishing our numbers, being very open with thought processes. We do a lot of writing internally, like memos and those types of things, that the team, they were craving the information still, but it was a little calmer because they knew that they were going to hear the information. And when we said, hey, we're working on this, we're going to have it Friday, there was anxiety, before that, that Friday, but it wasn't as much as I've heard in some other organizations where, there was a couple of our peers that discovered transparency during COVID. And it was really hard for them, because all of a sudden people were freaking out, and they finally were like, oh, let me just like lay it all out there. And that was the most calming thing that they could do.
Yep.
Patrick, it's interesting you bring that up because I think, oftentimes people will think, oh, transparency means the leader is giving all the information, they've got all of these answers and they're sharing them. And I think a lot of times, especially in situations like last year, transparency can really just be, hey, we don't have all the answers right now. Here's what we're doing to arrive at those answers. And here's when we'll give you them. So it's kind of it's not always limited to having the answers.
Well, it helps you be vulnerable too. And I think it's really hard. At least for me, it was hard to learn it's okay to be vulnerable with your team and just say like, I don't know. Now you kind of have to add like, but I'm figuring it out. Right. Because that's kind of what folks want to hear. But I think that when people try to posture and it gets tough because sometimes, you don't want to have like, different faces, right? But sometimes like when you're presenting to the whole company, your face is a little different than if you're one-on-one, right? And so I think it's just one of those things that it helps you kind of default to probably statistically the easiest conversations as well as the best outcomes, even though it sometimes still is really hard.
For sure. Well, so next thing I'm curious about, we've gone over all of these benefits. What would you say are the biggest costs of having more transparency? We all know that there's a dark side. You can share too much information. It can create, uncertainty amongst teams or customers. Are there any costs that you've seen at both Profitwell and Front?
You want to go ahead?
Go? No, you can go. Go ahead. I have a lot of fun ones. You probably have fun ones too. So go for it.
Well, I don't know if they're fun, but we'll keep the fun for after.
Love it.
But I think so. For me, I often talk about transparency is one of our values at Front. When an employee joins, we go over our values and we explain what they mean. And I often share that transparency doesn't mean sharing everything and anything, and that there is bad transparency and good transparency. Good transparency helps people answer questions, and bad transparency raises more questions. And so a cost of transparency is like you lose time just because you've shared information, then you need to explain. And I have so many examples like this, like, two of them could be, a few years ago, we had to part ways with one of our early employees. And so I did an all hands meeting and I shared parting ways with this person, wish the person the best. And then people came back to me saying, you're not transparent, you didn't tell us what happened. And then I had to tell them, well, there is something that's even more important than transparency, it's privacy. And in this case, I would not compromise privacy for transparency. And just like having to spend the time, explaining this because people expect a level of transparency, I think is definitely a cost. So that's why explaining it very early on matters. I think another example is salaries. Like, we're not transparent on salaries at Front just because I think it's typically something where it would raise more questions than it would answer questions. However, the way I think about it is if tomorrow all the salaries are public, then I'm very comfortable with fairness and I could explain it. Now, I don't want to spend the time explaining it just because I don't think it's a good use of company's time. But an example of this would be, we have an employee, like they have health issues. And so the health insurance we have can't work for them. So we pay them way more than market just because they don't use our health insurance. And it's like, what the point in me explaining this, And so I think there are so many examples like this where if people expect that you'll be transparent, then they don't understand that then so much time is going to be spent on explaining the why. And so trust is, I think, a prerequisite to transparency. Otherwise, the cost associated to it, which is really time, is too big.
Yeah, I think for us, we have some similar. So we don't share salaries, but we try to share I used to, my first job out of school was with the government and they have the GS levels, right? So you can kind of know what the levels are. So we try to kind of share those levels, but not who's at which level oftentimes, because that, then people can obviously back into what's going on. And it is kind of interesting because we found in certain cases for certain types of roles or certain types of, I think it's more of a personality thing than anything. sometimes like trying to go after radical transparency can actually make them feel incredibly uncomfortable, and uncomfortable for the right reasons. Meaning, a designer, for instance, if a designer has to show like the complete process or how they're going about something, oftentimes it can be, they want to kind of think through something, or they want to like do 3 iterations before they show you the 4th. And we never really like forced that, but there are some examples that are similar to that, where we were like, oh, like we probably shouldn't have tried to force the transparency. I think one thing that we had in our notes prior to today was Away, which was, one of a company that, created, I think, I don't know who coined this. If it was you guys get all the credit. If it was in the news, sure. But this whole surveillance culture where it was like no private conversations. And I think we've found ourselves not going that far before, but we've definitely been like, hey, let's like push this, to a group chat, only for the sake of efficiency, when really like we didn't understand some of the dynamics that were going on, where this person wasn't quite ready to like have the conversation with the group chat. We were kind of forcing them into it. So I do think it's one of those things where, like all things, you need a little bit of balance. And I think it comes down to, I like what you said, Mathilde, about the why, right? Like, how much is the why going to have to be explained? And maybe if the why, or the onus of the why, is different if it's in front of a whole group of people, where it's really hard to explain nuance. We've messed this up several times, where we didn't think enough about what we put out there, and then all of a sudden we thought it was just great being transparent, and people thought it was like the final bout, and it got us in trouble. But the why, the onus of the why, is probably a little bit different if it's a one-on-one conversation and we're talking about, your circumstance or something like that. I think another example, which maybe sparks some controversy in the conversation here, the Coinbase memos that took place in the last year. So I think, and trying to take as much of the politics out of it as possible, they released a memo kind of publicly, and I'm sure internally, that basically said, it's not important what it says, but they released a memo, and they probably went, they didn't vet it enough. And so it opened up massive amounts of different interpretations by the press, by their customers, by a bunch of other people, that forced them to then make another memo to clarify a bunch of things. But by that point, all of a sudden, like all the narratives, had gone in many different directions. And, whether their point was right or wrong is a little bit different. I'm trying to scope this into the transparency topic, but I think it was an interesting thing about transparency, where maybe they should have, really rethought how they were doing it, and if the why even needed to be explained publicly. Probably with the whole team it needed to be explained, but publicly was an interesting choice.
Yeah.
So I want to dive into the tactical piece here, because I know there's a lot of great initiatives that we've got going on at Front, and is going on as well at Profitwell, that will help open up transparency a little bit. So maybe it's 1 to 3 tactics for each of you that you really rely on to increase transparency with your team. Mathilde, I'll have you go first.
I mean, you should weigh in, Emily, too, because I think you would have a better idea of what's most impactful. I think 3 I could share. The first one is every time we have a board meeting, so every quarter we share the board deck. I think there is this perception that so many weird things happen at board meetings, and that maybe people don't know really how the company is doing. Well, we should just share it. And so I think that allows frontiers to know everything about how the business is doing. Number 2 is we have all hands on a weekly basis, and we always share how we're doing against our OKRs. And so, everyone always knows how we're doing from a revenue standpoint. Are we on time shipping things? Like, do we hire enough people? Like, no one is asking themselves, how is the company doing? So I think all hands are very important. And maybe one thing I would say about these 2 things that I think is a very important learning for me is you should have regular things happening to force you to be transparent, versus anytime you're transparent, it comes from you or another leader, because you need to be in a mindset where you don't have to think about being transparent. Otherwise, when something tough is going to happen, you're going to think twice about should I share this? And the answer is yes. But of course, like it's way harder to share something when it's bad news. The fact that you've made it recurring, so whether it's in all hands, it's a tradition of sending board decks, it's a dashboard that's in the office. Right now we can't see them, but one day we will see them again. Like, I think the fact that you don't have to think about it is super important. Maybe the last one that may be, less, maybe less widespread is all our calendars are public. So if people are at front are wondering, what am I doing right now? Well, I'm doing a podcast. But then if they're thinking, what am I doing after? Well, I have a one-on-one with our CRO. And I think that helps a lot.
That's cool.
And I can weigh in from a teammate perspective here. I often joke that the board decks are like getting a mini business degree for me. No other company have I been able to have 40 to 50 slides on, how we're generating revenue and how we're combating churn and things like that. So the board decks are huge for me.
That's cool. I think for us, we do some similar things. I think, but I want to kind of tie back to some of the principles. And I think you brought up some really interesting things here. Like proactivity, I think is super important, because I think, and you came about it by being like, hey, it should be a mindset. And I completely agree. But I think what we did wrong is we were in the early days, we're transparent, but you have to ask us, right? Like we'll give you transparency of what we think, is relevant. And obviously we'll share financials and all these other things, but we weren't being proactive enough. And as you grow, like people crave information, especially at companies. And when they're craving this, it's really important to almost like when someone told you like, hey, you're going to have to repeat your mission, these types of things over and over again, so people get it. It's very similar. So what we've done is we do very similar all hands every week. I think we normally were doing it every like 2 weeks, but then COVID, it was, just made sense to do it every week. And then at those all hands, we always have an ask me anything or ask us anything. We always have, we look at the top level things, OKR progress, these types of pieces. And then the other thing that we do as kind of an exec team is we try to get 2 memos written a month about either what's going on or like just in the business in general, or like going deep on, hey, this is the strategy. And they're not always written by us. Sometimes they're written by, someone who's, owning a project that's critical, or they're things around kind of values and principles, right? Because we oftentimes talk about certain things about, hey, this is really important to the company. And then there ends up being some misconception about it. And we just wanted to make sure that we were upfront about like, hey, this is what this means. And this is what this doesn't mean for a lot of the, not just values, but a lot of the like, common little cultural artifacts that kind of pop up over time. During the George Floyd kind of, events, like all of a sudden people were really craving like, how do we think about diversity? How do we approach it, right? They were just craving like, where do we stand on these types of things? And, it was like, okay, well, we didn't think we had to like clarify some of these things, but maybe we do, right? Like, it doesn't hurt us to be transparent about, how we think about the world and what we want to do as a company. But yeah, and I think the other big thing is just, pulling other people into it. I think you kind of alluded to that a little bit as well, where we try to, yes, repeat things over and over again as us, but we try to like make sure that we're pushing, some of those conversations or some of those kind of presentations to other members of the team, because it helps kind of permeate it throughout the culture. But yeah, those are hopefully some good additions to what you said, because I wholeheartedly agree with everything you said.
Amazing. Well, this was super insightful. Really great to chat with you both today. I learned a lot. I hope that everyone here on the call did as well. So thank you so much for joining. Like I said before, we'll be sending out the recording of this so you all can listen in or share with anyone you'd like afterwards. But thanks so much, Mathilde and Patrick.
Thanks, Emilia and Patrick.
Have a good one. Bye.
Thanks.